Let's jump right into one of the absolute greatest tech underdog stories ever told, AMD's golden age from 1999 to 2006. For years, the dynamic in the microprocessor world was basically set in stone. Intel led and AMD followed. But during this totally fascinating window from the late 90s to the mid-2000s, AMD finally stepped out of that massive shadow. Through incredibly bold innovation and razor-sharp engineering, they did the unthinkable. They didn't just compete with a reigning industry giant, they literally outperformed them.
So it really begs the question, right? How exactly do you outthink an industry giant? I mean, when a competitor has more money, way more market share, and decades of historical dominance, brute force just isn't going to cut it. In this explainer, we're going to see exactly how a smaller company manages to outmaneuver a true Goliath. And the answer lies in taking massive risks and completely rethinking the foundational engineering of the tech itself. It's an absolute masterclass in strategic innovation.
Between 1999 and 2006, AMD fundamentally flipped the script. To put it simply, AMD was no longer following, it was leading. The whole industry had grown so accustomed to Intel setting the pace, but AMD's breakthroughs during this era were so profound they became the true technological benchmark. They weren't just reacting to Intel anymore. They were actually dictating the future direction of the entire industry. And the stakes escalated rapidly across 4 key milestones. It starts in 1999 with the launch of the Athlon K7, accelerates into the 1 GHz milestone in 2000, fundamentally redefines computer architecture in 2003 with AMD 64, and climaxes with a massive 25% market peak in 2006.
Okay, so stepping out of Intel's shadow all starts with that first milestone, the Athlon K7. When this processor launched in 1999, it wasn't just some budget-competitive alternative. Oh no, it was a massive tremor that forced the entire tech world to sit up and pay attention.
The absolute secret weapon inside the Athlon was this thing called the Alpha EV6 bus. Think of it like upgrading a bumpy one-lane dirt road to a massive multi-lane superhighway. It allowed for significantly faster data transfer between the CPU and the rest of the computer system. They basically solved a critical bottleneck, essentially allowing the computer to think faster and communicate those thoughts without getting jammed up in digital traffic.
And this newfound efficiency completely set the stage for the ultimate speed race. Because the Athlon's architecture was so incredibly robust, raw speed became the main battleground at the turn of the millennium. The whole tech world was watching closely to see who would cross the next major mythical threshold in processing power. The race was officially on. That target? 1 GHz. And in the year 2000, AMD crossed that finish line first. They achieved a historic milestone by becoming the very first company to release a commercially available x86 processor running at 1 GHz. They beat Intel to the punch entirely. At the time, hitting 1 GHz had become highly symbolic of performance leadership. By getting there first, AMD sent a crystal clear message. We are leading the pack. It was just a massive psychological victory. But the battleground was about to shift from raw clock speed to the 64-bit architecture war. By 2003, with the introduction of the Athlon 64, AMD wasn't just trying to make processors run faster anymore. They were trying to completely redefine how computers processed complex data altogether. Now, the two companies took wildly different paths to achieve this, which is super fascinating. Intel went all in and heavily invested in Itanium, a very costly and complex 64-bit architecture. But its fatal flaw, it required entirely new software, basically forcing a massive ecosystem reset. Nobody wants that. AMD, on the other hand, took a highly pragmatic approach with AMD 64. Instead of trashing the existing ecosystem, they just extended the standard x86 architecture into 64-bit, ensuring full backward compatibility with all existing 32-bit applications. This meant users and developers could transition smoothly without sacrificing performance or rewriting everything from scratch. And because of that brilliant backward compatibility, AMD 64 became the industry standard. It didn't just win a temporary battle, it became the definitive blueprint for modern computing. The strategy was so effective and so beloved by the market that eventually even Intel was forced to adopt AMD's exact approach. They effectively had to validate AMD's vision, completely cementing AMD 64 as the foundation of the modern PC. Next up on their hit list, conquering the enterprise market. AMD realized, hey, our architectural advantages can absolutely scale beyond just desktop consumers. So they aggressively expanded into the highly lucrative and super demanding server market with their Opteron line. They were bringing the same innovative, boundary-pushing tech directly to data centers, taking the fight right to Intel's doorstep on all possible fronts. Over in the server space, they introduced the integrated memory controller. By putting this hardware right on the CPU die itself, AMD drastically cut down memory latency. It's kind of like moving a warehouse manager out of an offsite office and putting them directly onto the factory floor. Everything suddenly just moves way faster. The data didn't have to travel as far or jump through as many hoops. This created a massive, noticeable improvement in overall system performance, giving them an undeniable advantage that took Intel literal years to finally match. So, this massive enterprise push relied on three major pillars: the launch of the Opteron server line, the integration of the memory controller we just talked about, and AMD leading the way with the introduction of x86 dual-core processors. These dual-core innovations brought unprecedented multitasking power to both consumer and enterprise levels. And together, these three things gave AMD a totally undisputed performance edge across the entire tech industry. All of this relentless innovation compounded into the 2006 market peak. This was the absolute height of their success during this era. All that strategic outmaneuvering, the smarter architecture, the aggressive push into servers, it all coalesced into a stunning market reality. By 2006, AMD had captured roughly 25% of the global processor market. That is 1/4 of the entire global pie. This was their highest share ever achieved up to that point. It was a monumental blow to Intel and tangible financial validation that their years of taking these bold risks had spectacularly paid off. To quickly recap why AMD completely ruled this era, their processors were consistently faster. They utilized a smarter, backward-compatible architecture that actually prioritized the user. And they provided much more cost-effective options for both consumers and enterprise servers. They became the benchmark for the industry because they delivered on absolutely every single front. This incredible journey from 1999 to 2006 proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that bold risks can redefine an entire industry. AMD didn't just elevate their own company, right? They changed the very direction of computing itself. But it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to end on. If you fight your way from the shadows to the absolute peak of the market, what happens next? What happens to a company's culture and strategy when the underdog finally becomes the giant? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the tech around you actually came to be.